If you watch the news, you often notice that there is a lot of terrorism going on in the world. And there are different types of terrorism, but a lot of it seems to be associated with Muslim fundamentalist groups. And you might ask yourself, how come many Muslims that are extremists have resorted to terrorism in the past few decades? Obviously, I'm not trying to imply that every Muslim person in the Middle East is a would-be terrorist, because that would be very, very far from the truth. But I don't want to follow the opposite extreme of being politically correct and saying that Islam is a religion of peace and that relationship between all religions in the world are hunky-dory, because that is quite obviously not the case today. So I want to do two things today. First, ask what are the problems that the Middle East is facing today? And second, to end on a more positive note, what are the potential solutions looking forward? Well, that's the question that we will answer today. So why is it that there are so many terrorist groups in the Middle East? Well, what you need to understand, and I've covered some of that in previous videos in the class, is that the Middle East in general is a region that used to have its golden age and now has gone through a period of decline and questioning. The golden age of Islam would be from the time roughly of Muhammad in the 600s all the way to the 1600s. This is the time when militarily the Muslim armies were in a wave of expansion. Whether it's the Arab Empire in the 700s or 800s, or later on the Ottoman Empire from the 1200s forward, those armies would be able to conquer all the Middle East, North Africa, and even parts of Europe and Central Asia. This was also a time when economically the region was strong. It stood smack in the middle of the Silk Road, and so was a very important kind of transit hub for world commerce, and very rich as a result. It's also a time where scientifically Muslim scholars, mathematicians, astronomers, poets, all the important books were published in Arabic. Or you would go to the al-Qarawiyyin, which is the oldest university in the world. I think it was in Morocco. The golden age in the Middle Ages. As you move to the more modern era, and we had a video about the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire of India during 1500s forwards, we talked about the general decline during that period. A decline that would be economic, because all these areas were kind of bypassed in world commerce as new ways to get to India and China by sea were discovered by Vasco da Gama. And also an economic decline because the Industrial Revolution that happened in Britain did not happen in, say, Turkey or other Muslim areas. So they remained stuck in a more backward system of low-yield agriculture. This was also a decline that was intellectual, because all the important development that we've studied in the 18th century, whether it's the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, would be focused mostly in Europe. So whereas there were a lot of scholars in, say, Baghdad in the year 1000, by the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, it would be in Paris, in Berlin, in London, later on the US. This is where the important thought is being done. And that's true to the present time. Just look at the list of who won the Nobel Prize in physics or chemistry or what have you. In the past 100 years, you will not see too many academics coming from Egypt or Turkey or Morocco. So there's a sense of intellectual decline as well. One that would also be translated into military decline, because by the 1700s, the Ottoman Empire that used to control the Middle East started losing territories in Europe, in North Africa, and became known as the sick man of Europe. And we've encountered that sometimes in the class. We studied how in 1830, the French conquered Algeria, that used to be an Ottoman dominion. And the French also conquered Morocco and Tunisia nearby, and so all that area, the North Africa, became French protectorates. Nearby would be Libya, that became an Italian colony. Egypt became a British protectorate, and North Africa, like the rest of Africa, where a lot of Muslims live, would be European colonies by the late 19th century. But even the heart of the Middle East itself would be colonized by the time of World War I. When the Ottoman Empire was defeated alongside Germany in 1918, a lot of the territories from the Middle East would be split between France and Britain. So Palestine, which is today Israel, and then Jordan, and then Iraq became British territories for a while, and then the French had mandates in Lebanon and Syria. So militarily speaking, think of it. This is an area of the world that used to conquer everyone, and now you have foreign soldiers, Christian soldiers, occupying places in North Africa or the Middle East. Well, these areas are no longer colonies. There was a big wave of decolonization in the 1950s and 60s. So now places like, say, Algeria or Iraq or Syria or what have you are all independent. But militarily, there is still a sense of weakness that an area of the world that used to be dominant is now unable to maybe defeat Israel. And we had a video last time about the modern history of the State of Israel, a tiny country which somehow managed to prevail against all of its Muslim neighbors combined in 48, 56, 67, and 73 in 4 wars back to back. And it's a story of triumph for Israel, but if you look at it from the Muslim side, it's a humiliation, it's a catastrophe. And it's not just conflicts against Israel, it will be also against the United States. In 1991, for example, there was a major war between the United States and Iraq, the first Gulf War. And Iraq, for a while, was supposed to have the 4th largest military in the world and expanded a lot into weapons and such, and then was defeated in a matter of just a few days by the US military. And then you had a repeat in 2003 with the second Gulf War, where again the United States just brushed aside the Iraqi military with no time. Also in 2001, the US invaded Afghanistan. So you see a pattern there where time and time again, whenever you have a conflict in the modern age between the Muslim side and a Jewish state like Israel or a Christian state, majority Christian state like the United States, it seems like the Muslim side is on the losing end. So there's definitely a sense of decline, moral, scientific, economic, and military decline. And some of it has been obscured in the past few decades by the presence of oil. The fact that there is quite a bit in the Persian Gulf. I mean that some states like, say, Qatar or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia can have a very high standard of living, but you can see how it's a very fake kind of wealth that is just due to extraction of the oil, often with the help of foreign engineers, and it's a windfall that will not last forever. It's not really deep-rooted development. And so in many Middle Eastern states, you have a kind of 3-tiered society, where a lot of the manual labor will be performed by Filipino maids or Bangladeshi construction workers who are usually treated as second-class citizens or even downright modern-day slavery. Meanwhile, you have some more advanced engineering work that is usually done by Western workers from, say, the United States, much better treated, but living a life of isolation in Western-style compounds. And then you have the true local nationals who tend to do little of the work but receive a lot of the benefits. The question is, how sustainable is that model? If you have a very small population, as in Qatar, and a lot of, say, gas reserves, then you could potentially continue on for a long time like that. But if you are Saudi Arabia, where the population is booming, at some point you run into a wall when the oil will run out. You have too many people for those oil reserves, and so the standards of living will decline, unless you have planned for the future and start developing a more broad-based kind of economy, where it's not construction workers or engineers from abroad who do all the work. So people are aware that this is, even if though some states might be rich per capita, it's not really a sign of a well-distributed wealth that will last forever. And here we're talking about the place in the Middle East that do have a ton of oil. You have plenty of countries with a large population and no significant oil reserves, from Pakistan to Tunisia. So what is the future for those? Well, typically they have tended to immigrate from the Muslim world to richer countries, often the former colonial powers, whether it's France or Britain, another sign of the long-term decline of the region. So there's a general sense of decline in the Middle East, and everybody would kind of agree on that. The next question is, where do you go from there? What is a solution for renewal? And essentially 3 major scenarios have been outlined. The first scenario, one that is favored by many people in the West, including myself, would be to embrace free market democracy as the way forward. We had a video on Turkey 1920s under Mustafa Kemal, and that's pretty much what that was supposed to be. The idea being that you embrace Western values, including the separation of church and state, democratic elections, free market capitalism, and you hope that by that way you could reform Middle Eastern areas and have some economic development within a democratic context. It's an attractive proposition, but one that has not been tried too often in the Middle East. In fact, what you had more often in, say, the 1950s or 60s or 70s would be a second model, which would be still Westernization, but within a more authoritarian element. Later on, we're going to talk about Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser, and it's kind of what he had in mind to modernize Egypt by nationalizing the Suez Canal, building the Aswan Dam within an authoritarian environment. We also talk about the Shah of Iran in the 60s and 70s, and that was also his approach to development within Iran. And you could look at other rulers in the region, whether it's Hosni Mubarak in Egypt in the 80s, or Saddam Hussein for much of the 1980s or 90s. Or you could look at Bourguiba in Tunisia, later followed by Ben Ali, or next door Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, or al-Assad in Syria, both the father and the son. All of them follow the same development model of an authoritarian regime that was secular, separated from Islam. That's what they had in mind. A strong authoritarian ruler pushing you into modernity. By and large, all these rulers have been unsuccessful. And so those countries have remained rather poor per capita. And so you kind of get the worst of both worlds. You have a dictatorship, so a terrible human rights record, at the same time that you don't really have economic development. Despite the democratic shortcomings of many of these rulers, Western powers, including the US, have been willing to do business with them, in part because they were willing to let American corporations operate, and also because they were reliably anti-communist allies in the Cold War, which was of paramount concern. Also, there might be a bit of a prejudice against the Arab population in the Middle East, a feeling in Washington that those people are not quite ready for democracy yet, so it's better if you have a strong man in charge. So that has pushed a lot of people in the Middle East to embrace a third solution, one that is more return to your roots. The idea then would be that the last time that the Muslim world was strong, the golden age, was in the early days of Islam. Where there was no separation of church and state. Instead, the rulers would be caliphs that would be also leaders of the faith. And there was a strong connection to Sharia Muslim law. And the thinking is that if the Middle East was last strong when it was strongly connected to its faith, then that might be the way looking forward. So it's kind of bizarre, but the way to look toward the future would be to go back to the year 700, to go back to your roots, to a more literal interpretation of Islam as a way to purify the nation as a whole, roughly. And so that's kind of the agenda that you will see pushed forward by, say, Osama bin Laden, the terrorist originally from Saudi Arabia, later on headquartered in Afghanistan, the leader of al-Qaeda, the one that was responsible for the 9/11 attacks in 2001 against New York City. Even though Osama bin Laden ended up at odds with the country of his birth, Saudi Arabia has a very similar agenda, where the law is also based on Sharia law, the law of the Quran. The same would be true of, say, Iran after 1979 and the overthrow of the Shah, or as far away as the Sultanate of Brunei, all the way in Southeast Asia. Some of these laws might seem barbaric for the 21st century, such as stoning adulterous women or chopping off the hands of thieves, but that's pretty much the point. The idea that going back to a medieval era is somehow purifying the faith and looking forward. So that's kind of where we stand nowadays in the Middle East. A tension between those three basic groups. And if you follow the news, a few years ago, we had what was called the Arab Spring, where in places like, say, Egypt, long-time authoritarian rulers were ejected. And that was true also in Libya, in Tunisia, to some extent in Syria as well. And so you moved from one development model, which was to have a pro-Western authoritarian regime, to what initially looked like a democratic system, where you had free and fair elections that were organized in Egypt and elsewhere. Except in many of these states, eventually the people that won the elections, the more popular group, would be Muslim fundamentalist parties that wanted to bring back Sharia and a very traditional interpretation of Islam. And that would be the third kind of way forward, which in many states, including Egypt, led the leaders to kind of overthrow the results of the election and go back to Plan 1, an authoritarian kind of dictatorship. So that's where we are in the Middle East nowadays, running around in circles. In the region, you had some long-serving authoritarian secular leaders like Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi that stayed on forever, promised the world, but never delivered much in terms of democracy or economic development for their subjects. On the other hand, you had some Muslim fundamentalist regimes, as in Saudi Arabia or Iran, that tend to be quite stable, but also embrace visions of justice or women that are quite backward. In 2011, you had that brief moment of hope during the Arab Spring, but what that led in many cases was to elections, whether in Tunisia or Egypt, that led to the rise of more Muslim fundamentalist regimes that are very anti-Western, or in the case of Syria, a very long, ongoing civil war that also facilitated the rise of some extremist groups like ISIS that then carried out terrorist attacks in places like Paris. So altogether, a lot of bad scenarios, at least if you look at it from the perspective of Europe or the United States. What we'll do in the next couple of videos is to see in more detail how that plays out in practice. And we'll focus on Egypt intensively, and then we'll move to Iran intensively and see how Iran itself moved from an authoritarian regime to one aligned with terrorist groups and a Muslim fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. See you next time.